True crime. Evil human experiments. 5 macabre experiments conducted on humans in Asia. Written by Lillian Lowe. Narrated by Araceli Gauthier. Introduction. In the name of science. For centuries, humankind has been on the journey to quench their thirst for knowledge of the unknown, spawning multitudes of inventions and cures we would have never believed to see in our day. Our science classes in school acquainted us with the likes of Nikola Tesla and Madame Curie, bold, pioneering figures who toiled for countless hours to bring us a better understanding of alternating electric currents and radioactivity. Then, you have the more eccentric, but nevertheless determined folks who were famed for their out-of-the-box thinking. For one, sociologist Mauricio Montalbini, who spent over 200 days alone in a cave. Or Regina Grice, the Canadian biologist that allowed bed bugs to feast on her flesh 180,000 times. And of course, there's those that have arguably, foolishly sacrificed their own lives to prove their theories, like Wan Hu, a Ming Dynasty official who strapped rockets to his chair in the first ever attempt for takeoff, or the Austrian-born Frenchman Franz Richelt, who jumped to his death from the Eiffel Tower in an effort to demonstrate his complicated parachute pants, despite many attempts to dissuade him. But just how far would some go? Thanks to the media surrounding us our entire lives, when we think of evil scientists, the imagery of elderly men with crazy shocks of hair jutting out in all directions usually springs to mind. Add in a white coat, have him cackling with his head theatrically thrown back, rubbing his hands together in a sinister fashion next to bubbling test tubes and over-engineered contraptions with some varying notion of world domination, and you've got yourself a classic stereotype. Only, in real life, the several documented cases unearthed in the last couple of years of those that severely abused their power and the unimaginable horrors inflicted onto their hapless patients are very genuine. Much is known about the savagery of the Nazi regime and those that suffered under the hands of Josef Mengele, as well as the covert, unethical experimentation in the United States, both physical and psychological. But what about their neighbors in the East? In this book, we take a look at 5 different cases of some of the most gruesome human experimentation ever to occur on Asian soil. Chapter 4. Japan, the Mad Science of Shiro Ishii. Modern-day Japan holds a treasure trove of advanced robotics and technology, exquisite culinary delights, one-of-a-kind artistry, and an entrancing traditional culture greatly appreciated by those around the world. It is the land where exotic, and at times eccentric, is multiplied on a whole other level, exemplified by their fascinating, rich tapestry of unique game shows and media, earning it a consistent spot in the top 20 tourist spots of 2015. Besides being the masterminds behind ingeniously serving raw fish and scrumptious treats wrapped in rice and rolled in sheets of nori seaweed, and their constant dedication to presenting the world with an escalating number of uncannily, lifelike, humanoid robots and pioneering technology, Japanese citizens have earned themselves a reputation for their peaceful, orderly ways. An instance that highlighted this phenomenon was during the recent earthquake and tsunami that devastated the nation in 2011, with sympathizing, mourning citizens around the globe impressed by the way the locals were handling the disaster, lining up in neat, courteous lines as they awaited for food, shelter, kerosene, and relief. It was a refreshing contradiction to the riots that engulfed cities resulting from something as trivial as a lost hockey game. But the low crime rates and civil harmony present-day Japan enjoys tells a very different story to the one lurking in the nation's extensive history, one that many till this day still refuse to speak of. The The Second World War was a nightmarish example of human barbarism at its finest. Adolf Hitler and his reprehensible, feared Nazi army are names most commonly associated with the Great War, but the Imperial Japanese Army was no exception. On top of the massacre and countless uncivilized sex crimes committed in Nanking, the comfort women they enslaved, using middle schoolers to create weaponry, and mass forced deportations of civilians forcefully relocated to foreign lands against their will, the monstrous savagery of Unit 731 was so hideous, it would take decades before those involved finally broke their silence. Staunchly girdled by towering earth walls garnished with tangles and tangles of high-voltage wires, guarding close to 150 fully equipped, meticulously mapped-out buildings, Unit 731 was a flourishing facility like no other. A region lavish with precious minerals and resources such as wood, coal, gold, as well as the ample supply of soy, corn, and cattle, Manchuria was a prime target of invasion. The Kwantung Army of the Imperial Japanese Forces barged in and took the reins in 1931. They began by completing the train network commenced by the Russians, and soon made the land one of their primary causes of the war, devoting extra time and attention. Within weeks, Manchuria was renamed Manchukuo, and an estimated 5 million young Japanese folk were swarming into the land. Asengiro Puyi, more commonly known as the last emperor of the Qing dynasty in China, was made chief executive of the Manchu state, and later enthroned as the emperor of the Manchukuo Empire. Puyi was made their lead marionette to keep the public at bay, and though it was said that he clashed with their views behind the scenes, he carried out their wishes and maintained his composure to lessen the apprehension amongst his people. In 1938, authorities began mustering the staff members of Unit 731 in the Pinfeng district of Harbin. The recruitment was done in the guise of a misleadingly titled program labeled Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification, promoted across Japan, the majority of which were esteemed medical universities. One of the surviving Japanese staff members of Unit 731, a young man in his late teens at the time, remembers how his parents had encouraged him to go on with the program, hoping it would lead him on the path to a brighter future. They promised him that since he wasn't enlisted as a soldier himself, if he felt misplaced or even the slightest bit homesick, he could head right on home, even assuring him they'd make the trip and escort him home themselves if needed be. Arriving at 5:30 at dawn, along with dozens of other recruits of his batch, he harks back on how numbingly freezing the weather was. His teeth chattered involuntarily. His limbs were deadened from the frigid gust of frosted air blowing past them, and his cap had frozen solid. And when they marched into the enclosed, brooding premises of the massive camp, it slowly registered that what would ensue would have never crossed anyone's predictions. Those who had the grave misfortune to come across Dr. Shiro Ishii, a celebrated doctor with a degree in bacteriology from the top-ranking Kyoto Imperial University, recalled him as a stern, domineering man with determination that exceeded his peers, and in this case, it was what made him all the more terrifying. Naturally equipped with a high forehead that commanded authority, coupled with his trademark blank stare, and standing at least 6 feet tall, his imposing height dwarfed the majority of those who served under him, adding weight to his already unbreakable, intimidating exterior. Dr. Ishii had undoubtedly an incredible mind when it came to medical sciences, capturing the attention of Emperor Hirohito himself when he masterminded a way to remove pollution from contaminated water sources for soldiers who were falling ill from consuming water swimming with liquid parasites. After completing his studies at university, he went on a mission to further enrich his knowledge, returning to Japan after visiting hospitals and clinics in over 30 different countries. And when the construction of Unit 731 came to completion, this man was made director of the camp. Stretched out on a square of land totaling 6 square kilometers in size, the 150 building parameters were split into 8 different sections, the most perturbing of which included the following: bacteriological research, warfare research, and field experiments, and bacteria mass production and storage. Only Japanese companies were allowed to work on the interior of the camp, and when the construction concluded, many of the construction workers were kept to act as the camp's security guards. Over 10,000 staff and security banded together in scheduled groups, patrolling cells that housed 4 to 5 war prisoners captured from China, Korea, Mongolia, and the Soviet Union, crammed in each cold, dingy cell. In addition to the inhabitable squalor they were forced to live out their last days in, all cells were fitted with interlinking gas pipes above them, prepared to drop gas bombs on the imprisoned if they were ever to riot. As seen in Kisu, The Untold Story of Unit 731, a documentary film produced by Marathon Productions, a former staff member tells us of how their prisoners were referred to as logs, a move to perhaps dehumanize their victims. And, like Pol Pot staff at S-21, intricately detailed archives were kept to keep track of each prisoner, including full-body photographs shot at different angles. Clipped to each record, their solemn faces and vapid expressions knowing of their wretched fates. Dr. Ishii was resolute in changing the game of biological warfare with his outrageously demented experiments, free to do so with apparent backing from the Imperial Japanese Army, like a spoiled, overambitious child left to wreak havoc until he got what he wanted. The first of his insanity began with his special classes on how to culminate lethal bacteria. One alarm bell would be the fact that the unit measured bacteria by the kilogram as opposed to the approved dozen-gram dosages. It was estimated that the staff had produced enough bacteria lethal enough to destroy the world several times over. A staff member who participated in bacteria experimentation described the uniforms he shared with around the 20 other young medical students assigned to a class, carefully sealed jumpsuits, an enormous gas mask, and dark goggles, like an army of oversized mosquitoes in robes. He spoke of how violently his body had trembled when he was first called up to the plate, none of them having been told their subjects for testing were live and human. Feeble and submissive, he kept his eyes squeezed shut as he injected a whimpering man with plague bacteria. And with different intervals of 24 and 30-hour waiting periods, they observed the grisly symptoms kick in. Within a couple of days, the agonizingly dying subjects spread out on metal slabs like butchered meat were excessively losing weight, their sagging skin so horribly blackened the staff had trouble telling them apart. The staff member relayed that none of the staff members trusted each other, all fearing for their lives, and admitted that after some time, he began treating it like any other job. The staff had begun figuring out ways to coax the victims into cooperating, the most popular method consisting of bribing prisoners with a small piece of stale, unspoiled bread easily snuck past authorities. Besides the plague, prisoners were forcibly injected with syringes containing contagious cholera, typhus, and typhoid viruses. And because they were so easily transmitted, even Japanese staff who contracted diseases went along with those who dared say nay to the authorities, hurled into the cells and rendered immediate logs. This brings us to the infamous vivisection rooms housed in the education department of the camp, where medical staff in training performed live surgeries on prisoners. This was done in the nauseating comforts of a tiled room, centered with a hollowed-out block that served as the table, with a pit that collected blood for observation. Because those who were reluctant to perform surgeries were either starved or imprisoned for testing, the majority of the recruited did as they were told. An interviewed doctor, Masakuni Kuri, spoke about a surgery he performed on a woman he injected with syphilis, hauntingly recalling how blood poured out of her like water from a tap because she was alive. Another, by the name of Ken Yuasa, a veteran of 14 surgeons, tells another ghastly tale of a sobbing Chinese man blubbering for his life, aggressively beaten until he finally cooperated. This same man was held down as an unskilled vivisectionist sliced him open, enduring 60 different experiments in under an hour and a half until his unavoidable death, one in which his arm was brutishly amputated. After the surgeries, they were tasked to clean the bodies with coarse scrubbing brushes attached to the end of long sticks, harvesting and storing their infected organs for later study. A last horrifying account tells of a stoic, seemingly unafraid man marching to the operation table unaccompanied a supervisor, declaring to the speechless staff that this was proof of submission to the Japanese. And of course, we have the fleas. To Dr. Ishii, fleas and rodents held the brilliant solution to his cause. Along with poisonous gas bombs and other weaponry constructed by the plant in Okushima Island, fleas and rats were shipped in, which were then infected with extremely contagious virus strains. This was done in the hopes that flea and rodent carriers would infect enemy forces. To test Ishii's theory, a circle of prisoners were shackled with their extended arms hooked behind the planks of stakes out in the field, only armored with a single helmet on their heads. Planes would fly by routinely, dropping toxic gas bombs encased around ceramic jars containing diseased fleas. The helmets protected the prisoners from the raining shards, and later would be hoisted down and brought back to the laboratories for examination. When the war finally came to an end upon attacks at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, orders were enforced to demolish Unit 731 and to remove any trace of evidence. To flush out all the remaining prisoners, they released the gas bombs built into their cells, and their corpses were later loaded onto trucks and incinerated at a separate location, dumping the bags of ashes under a bridge. After hoarding all the bombs into the buildings, the staff quickly evacuated. What was most exasperating of all was that the crimes of Unit 731 were left ignored during the trials, many of the staff members leaving unscathed, living full lives surrounded by their loved ones, as seen in multiple interviews. And yes, this included Dr. Shiro Ishii himself, who went on to quietly run a family hostel until his death in the 1950s. To this very day, the macabre crimes of the Japanese during the war are often hushed, statistics showing that detailed accounts are left out of 9 out of every 10 educational textbooks, a subject many believe should remain in the past.